Sharing everything on online, social media. We have a, a Slack channel available for people to network after. I can see we have Don with us. Hi, Don. How you doing?
Hey, Bryan.
So Don DePalma from CSA Research. He's founder, from what I understand correctly. And Don is responsible for launching and developing the preeminent market research firm for the language service sector. So I know Don's the chief strategist at CSA and is, I guess, in other words, or lack of better terms, a wealth of information. Every time I talk to Don, I'm always kind of left dumbfounded with the insight and perspective that he provides. So often I'm quiet and just taking everything in, which I think this is a great venue for, because everyone's going to be able to sit, take everything in, take the notes they want, and hit you with questions after the presentation. So with that, we have the end of the language business as we know it. Don, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can take it away.
Okay. Let's see, am I projecting the right thing now? This is always the challenge with Zoom. Let's see.
You are getting...
There we go. Well, thank you, Bryan. I'm pleased to be here at Low from Home. The first of which sure to be a lot of web-based conferences that'll increase the number or decrease the number of miles and hotel stays and bad restaurant meals that we all deal with. The title of my presentation riffs off a 1987 song by REM, The End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. The questions that I'll address today are how the language sector will respond to COVID-19 and the changes that it's forced on everyone, on every industry and every country. I'll deal with some of the practicalities and the real world background of this that affects this industry from outside. Each of you on the call today has your own story of how it's affected you, your family, your friends, your businesses. My hope and wishes for everyone today is that REM's subtitle, and I Feel Fine, is how and where we'll all end up after this situation ends. So with no further ado, let's move on to the three major topics. The first is the state of the language market during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, what's really interesting here is that language has become an issue for a lot of Americans. We're starting to see in various places notices in languages that they don't necessarily speak, or for the people who do speak those languages, if they're seeing information that's really critical to their health and well-being throughout the course of this event. So this is from Seattle. Who would have thought that Russian would be a major issue for the public health system? Of course, there's Russians everywhere. The state of the market is also tied to the macroeconomic activity that's going on, what's happening in the marketplace, the demand side, the supply chain, all of the things that make up the language industry come together and create the delivery of translation, of interpreting, of localization, the various other services that companies in the space provide. What I'll do here is I won't predict the future and tell you exactly what will happen. I don't think anyone can do that at this point, and I'll give you some of the reasons why that's important and something you should keep in mind when you're planning, because there's no set answers, no formula to what's going on now. Anyone who's following the news knows that pretty well by now. And I'll finish with some points on future-proofing your business. I'll focus on things that you can do to improve the likelihood that your business, your profession, your livelihood will survive and thrive post COVID-19. Now, the theme of today's webinar, of this presentation, is really simply look to what's coming rather than what's past. Don't prepare for a return to the past, because it's highly unlikely, and again, for things that we'll look at, that we will go back to things as they were. Everyone talks about the new normal to the point where that's become an overused cliche. What we have is a future that is as yet indeterminate. So what you should be doing instead is preparing yourself to be more competitive in this post-pandemic future. In other words, don't look backwards with nostalgia, but take a clear-eyed approach to being ready for whatever the future brings to you. So let's start now with the state of the language market. And some data from our surveys of enterprise buyers, of language service providers, and freelancers that we've published on how COVID-19 has affected what you do. Since the middle of March, we've been surveying various constituencies in the language market, conducting leadership council sessions with enterprise translation buyers and with the managing directors and CEOs of some of the largest LSBs. We've also been running open access webinars. We just had one yesterday, and conducting dozens of interviews for various aspects of what's going on in the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of you on this Low from Home session have likely participated in our surveys, briefings, interviews, other interactions that we've had. Now, there's two findings that are really interesting and from the 193 largest providers, the top ranked companies from our language services report from last year that stand out above all the others. The first is a shutdown in demand from clients. That's the general slowdown in the market. And the second is the uncertainty about the length of the pandemic. This is really critical in that nobody really knows how long it's going to go on. And this is a tough issue for leaders to deal with. And importantly, it also puts a big strain on employees. And that's why CEOs are so concerned in the next item here, paying salaries, keeping their overall team in place. Because those are the people who actually run the business, who run the operations, who are customer facing, who do all the work. Those are the people that the customers pay your companies in order to do the work for them. Further down the list are some basic issues, things like accounts receivable, accounts payable. Again, all outcomes of the drop in demand and stress on the supply chain and people up and down, people you owe money to, people that owe money to you, not paying. And we also have an infrastructure technology issue, the ability of remote employees to seamlessly service clients. Once you send all of your employees out to the winds to work from their apartments, from their kitchens, from wherever they happen to be working from, you begin to lose some of the teammate work, the camaraderie, the cross-fertilization and help that everybody can give just by reaching over or popping up into the next cube. So these are the major issues and the companies have been dealing with, and they continue. Just even in our call yesterday, these issues keep coming up over and over again. The uncertainty has extended now with concerns about how it's spreading in various markets and reaching its peak. We've also seen that on the in our demand side and supply surveys, that demand across the board, it's mainly down or flat. Business overall had decreased for about half our sample. Across the board, this was a few weeks ago, 87% of employees are now working remotely. What we're seeing is a return in some places, for example, for some of the larger companies that have big offices in China. People have been going back to the offices, but they've been practicing social distancing in those environments. So instead of having 50 people in a room, they may have instead just a dozen spread out 2 meters apart. What's interesting is in one of the calls, some of the CEOs started speculating on whether they would need as much real estate in the future as they currently pay for. If people are happy working at home, why not let them do so? And they can stop renting offices. It's not good news for companies like WeWork and HQ, but everybody will be affected across the board. We've also seen on-site interpreting has, for all intents and purposes, ceased. We have a report coming out later today that looks at the replacement for on-site interpreting, which is a variety of remote interpreting modalities, what we're calling distance interpreting. And then finally, anyone who's been paying attention to the news knows that there's an enormous number of people who have become unemployed. In turn, we've got hiring that's not happening at companies in the sector. From the demand and supply side and localization departments and in LSPs, nobody's hiring. Travel has stopped, no one's getting raises. In fact, some people are getting haircuts, that is across the board cuts, in order to keep more people working instead of laying everybody off. And of course, as this conference online is testament to the fact that over the course of the last couple of months, the annual standbys like Localization World, Loc Gala, and some of the others have just had to cancel. There's very few people gathering together, especially after the Biogen debacle in Boston, where one of the medical companies ended up being a vector for the disease out of Boston. So basically, what you see now as well with all of this unemployment activity is a lot of looking by companies at ways that they can deal with their payroll. There's work such as Kurzarbeit in Germany and Austria. There's a variety of programs such as in the United States that is right now continually being debated with all sorts of interesting sides, groups taking sides in what's going on. There's more money that will be spent by governments in the next couple of months than they have probably over the last couple of years on employees. So where that leaves us here is, by the way, the place where you can find a lot of this information is at our COVID-19 landing page. The yellow highlighted thing at the top of the page here tells you how to get there. If you just go to csa.research.com, it'll tell you how to get there. And on that site, you'll find the survey data, such as I just listed, as well as some analysis, some reports that we've done on various things, including things like leadership in the time of COVID-19, analytical articles on the use of flexible translation technologies, on this notion of customer loyalty programs and how important they are, especially during periods like this, and then the importance of retaining highly trained teams. That one's called the team factor, and that picks up the idea of why you should retain your teams and how you could go the pluses and minuses of keeping them on board. There's open access webinars. You could get on the mailing list to those, know when they're happening. And then there's some external resources that are posted there as well. Some interesting things on software tools, training, and health data. We've got some more bits coming up in the next couple of days. So basically, this is a constantly updated site. Take a look. So let's move on to the next section of today's presentation, the macroeconomic impact. In that this touches every country, every sector, every person on the planet. Now, for those of you who were out sick the day they taught macroeconomics in college, it's the branch of economics that deals with the performance, the structure, the behavior, the decision-making of an economy as a whole. It involves regional, national, and global entities and economies. It describes basically how an overall economy behaves, and that is, the market systems that operate on a large scale. It studies phenomena such as what we're looking at now, as well as inflation, price levels, the rate of economic growth, national income, gross domestic product, all of the fun stuff that puts many people to sleep. And so the big question here is, what does this mean to the language industry? As an industry that generates tens of billions of dollars in revenue, it enables companies and governments to meet the expectations of their constituencies, of their customers, of their prospects, to communicate in a language that those customers or constituents understand. So it's indisputably a key component of the global economy and a linchpin in business globalization. Without it, people just couldn't communicate as well as they do and transact as much as they do. So how will the coronavirus affect the language industry? As one of the things that we do in our market research, we rely for our annual estimates on multilateral or international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the Organization of Economic Cooperative and Development and the United Nations, International Telecommunications Union, ITU, for a lot of data about how things come together. We also do our own research, can't read, won't buy, on consumer and business behaviors. What the IMF does is at least twice a year, January and June, they put out this World Economic Outlook. And what they projected in January at the beginning of the year was a rather big news, given the questions about what was going on before the pandemic here, is they said that they would go from their projections going to 2.9%, a drop of about 0.1 percentage points for 2019 and 2020. And that was a result of some negative surprises to economic activity, some things that didn't happen that they expected would have happened with India. So what they did was they stepped back in January and said, things aren't going to be as good as we thought they were going to be. Just last week, they reissued some new guidance that took into account the 3 months of the pandemic and what's been going on, and the peaks and valleys of containment. And what they did was they downgraded their estimate on global growth down to where it's going to be in the negative numbers, -3. And this is a downgrade, as they point out, of 6.3% percentage points from January. And that is a major revision. We look at these guys every year, and if they're talking about 0.2%, that's a pretty big move for them in terms of refactoring the economy. To drop as much as this over the course of just a 3-month period shows the severity of this particular situation. And what it does is it underscores for me the importance of everybody planning around the fact that this isn't going to be something that is here today, gone tomorrow. Anyone who's been following the go back to work, stay at home activity questions and the debates that are going on know for sure that this is a major issue. Just heard from my daughter who lives in Tokyo that the pubs have closed down at 8 o'clock every evening. That's apparently because the coronavirus doesn't come out until 8 in the evening. But you have this kind of activity going on in the market, these kinds of attitudes and sort of a notion that this really isn't, that this isn't something, it's a simple kind of thing. It's something that's going to take some time to play out. So let's look at how it's going to play out. Here is a picture of that you'll see in your macroeconomics 101 book, which lays out all of the variables in the supply and the demand, all of the activity that goes on in a business, in the business world and across various social institutions, including governments and churches and all that other kind of stuff. Now, the big thing here is that the language industry serves a global market. It is a global business, and the company that's providing language services for a US company or for a UK company or for a Chinese company doesn't have to be anywhere nearby. The supply chain stretches, the companies stretch. So this sort of goes against the conventional wisdom that the language industry is counter-cyclical and immune from many economic phenomena. Now, we've all said this at some point. We look at the data, we look at 2008 and said, well, they didn't really crater very much back then. I wouldn't put very much faith in those kinds of statements. This is an industry that exists to meet worldwide demand for language services. When that demand drops, the size of the market suffers. And what we have this time around is that entire sectors of the global economy are no longer consuming goods and services. So what we see now, according to Larry Summers, who is a chief economist at the World Bank and was an official in President Clinton and President Obama's cabinets, he has said that he's an economist at Harvard now. Economic time has stopped because of the pandemic. Stopped. So what we've got here is the pause button, the pandemic pause button. This pause on economic time is unprecedented. In past economic events, you might have terminated temporarily things like flights due to an Icelandic volcano, or economic activity shuts down because of a tsunami in Indonesia or Japan, or regions that where gas prices get so laughably low that are with the gas prices so laughably low now, you wonder how economies would shut down because they got so high. So basically, these are things that have been short-term in the past. This is longer term. So how COVID-19 is different from past pandemics and natural disasters and conflicts is that this isn't like the Peter Pan thing. All of this has happened before and it'll happen again. It's instead what economists will call a black swan event. This is something which is uncharted territory. Instead of it happening before and it'll happen exactly like this again, it's a major surprise. It has no precedent. It has a major effect on the market, and it's often rationalized with hindsight. For example, when a world leader says after the fact, after a lot of stuff has happened, I felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. The bottom line, and why everyone has to plan extra long and hard about this, is because there's never been anything like this before. So everybody's learning as we go along, and it'll take some time to get this all back on track. Now, the next few slides are important for business planning. They underscore the particular challenges of coming out of this particular downturn. This slide shows the on what we've seen this year is the beginning, the onset, and the peak, and coming out of the pandemic for various countries. China got hit first, and what we saw in China is when it shut down all production, They began operating again, sending people back into factories in mid-March. By the third week in March, roughly 70% of factory workers were back on the job. Most were expected to be there by everyone back on the job by mid-April. The problem is, what are those factories going to produce for the rest of the world when it isn't consuming anything? So if you think about this in a global economy, we got China producing stuff for the world, which isn't buying something. When the world gets back online and starts buying something, will China be in a second pass of COVID? Will all of the economies ultimately come together and align? And that's something that, again, we've never had this problem before at this scale. Countries will come back online at different times, but what that means is the globalized world is out of alignment. And as a service that keeps multilingual trade and communications going, that's where the language service sector comes back into the market. What we do is we analyze the industry on two axes: macro, what the overall industry does, and this is really hard to influence unless you're of an enormous scale, or you're really visible, or you've got a demand driver, or you're a phenomenal disruptor in the marketplace. They can have effects on the market. We also look at micro activities, what individual companies can do, and how they're responding to the pandemic. And that's really where a lot of the work has to be done moving forward. What we have here, I know there's dozens of articles out there about various scenarios. There's presentations in the course of Loc from Home on what's going to happen, but it all boils down to basically two economic activities. The industry comes back as it was, relatively unscathed, or the industry comes back after a longer term recession. Then we've got some things that talk about some changes to the fundamentals. The industry comes back with a lot of consolidation, or the industry is transformed with new technology. So let's look at these things. And I should note that this is a quick trip through something that is a much broader discussion. Sector scenario 1 and 2, we see a downturn, a recession, a recovery. The IMF is pretty convinced that there's going to be a recession. So the ideal here would be that the industry suffers a sharp decline followed by a sharp rise back to its peak. This is what economists call a V-shaped recovery. It follows that pattern, and it's the return to economic activity, the increased demand in spending and government stimulus. All of this pushes things along. A lot of pain can happen in that trough during the decline because people are put out of work. Entire supply chains are disrupted. And Larry Summers, back to him from Harvard, costs mount because the financial clock continues to tick with interest payments, rent, other obligations, everything you have to pay, accounts still due to lenders and landlords. What we have here, though, is this is an ideal if things go back pretty much to where they were. So the time out economic blip here is just a blip. But the issue here is that there could be a W-shaped recovery where you get a dip, a return, a dip, a return, a dip, and a return. And that's how some epidemiologists are looking at the question of whether COVID goes away, we end up with the fall flu, we end up with a COVID-20, all of these things continue happening. And so right now what we have, as well as an epidemic, is we also have an epistemic problem. Here, nobody knows what's going on. We also have epistemic bipolarity with the same people sometimes saying different things depending on the day, but that's a different discussion. Scenario 3, this is the consolidation and remixing of the industry. It's not an economic recovery. The pandemic is going to have winners and losers in the marketplace. We can be sure of that. What that'll mean is that some of the supply chain, some of the companies can be picked up by larger ones. ISVs, the technology vendors, may get together in order to create a stronger company coming out of the pandemic. And as this slide shows, there's going to be a lot of providers of language services taking advantage of market opportunities, and also looking at the language technologies that are out there, which show up in scenario 4 here. All of the natural language processing activity, the mechanization or automation of activity by humans, the MT work that's already being used by most LSPs at some point, but using by many clients, as well as the data-driven technologies that Alex was just talking about here that are going to change the content playing field. Machine learning, augmented translation, semantic enrichment. I've got a lot of research on what's going on there. And then importantly, the power of Amazon Web Services, of Microsoft Azure, of the various other cloud-based computing resources, mean that there's enormous power that can be used to train engines, to do all of those neural models that will inform the industry, inform everyone in their work moving forward. So that's basically the way that we see the market playing out. So more consolidation and a tremendous amount of automation is driving the industry. But if you really want to know when COVID-19 will end forever and what's going to happen next, I always say go to the experts. So our friend Zoltar, the 8 Ball, and of course the group of 7 that meets periodically and tells us what we should do. The guy with the red tie knows everything, so just consult him. Now let's move into the next level, the final part of this presentation on the micro part, reimagining your company for whatever comes next with this company level future proofing. The idea is that something's going to happen. There is a future. We don't know exactly what that future is going to be. So how can you take some of the stuff we've talked about, the automation, the consolidation, the other activities, and take advantage of that? While the market is on pause, what we say is assess and optimize. So going back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, in each pause, I hear the call. Or Dov Seidman, who is famous for being cited in Thomas Friedman's Lexus and the Olive Tree and the various other books for his how methodology. How do we do things really matter? When you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. When you press the pause button on a human being, they start. That's when they begin to rethink and reimagine. And this is the time to start rethinking and reimagining. The important bit in all of this is that with the recovery of demand that will happen when, as things gradually reopen in various parts of the world, is that people will still demand native language support. Can't read, won't buy research shows that regularly, even for people who are comfortable in other languages, they always prefer getting information in their own language. So the pandemic, one of the side effects will not be that everybody can speak every language on the planet. It's not going to happen. But what we can see is this increase in business around longstanding and new requirements, such as want to be in every country kind of global corporate strategy, customer experience and digital transformation activities, just the unrelenting growth that we see in digital content and speech volumes, the support, the desire to have all of that information in every channel, whether it's social media, whether it's apps on phones, whether it's online, whether it's print, whether it's on television or cable, wherever it happens to be, there's a concern to have that information everywhere. And then there's new devices constantly coming on, raising the requirement for more languages. There's another phenomenon, which is a constantly advancing regulatory compliance. If you don't have the right materials translated, for example, for a pharmaceutical filing, you might end up losing an entire year before you can sell in that market. So the big thing here, some future will happen. You can do a lot to prepare. As you exit the reactive stage of the pandemic, that is the point we've been in now, and there's sort of a steady state that kind of feels like The Edge of Tomorrow or Groundhog Day or the Fair, these time loop kinds of movies. Things just keep happening the way they were. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. What you should do during this period is systematically review people, process, technology. Importantly, the people who were untrained working for you and clueless in January 2020 will still be untrained and clueless when the pandemic ends, unless you actually go off and start training them. The processes that infuriated your customers and your practitioners since 2009 will still provide that horrible customer experience. Figure out how you can improve them. Technology, the content management and translation software, the interpreting delivery platforms, all of those systems that didn't work well, that didn't scale, that really stunk before the pandemic, will still be bad software after COVID 2019 dissipates. So the big thing here is optimize while economic time is frozen. We've got a few levels of people that we talk about. There's the language traditionalists, the people who have done things as they always have done. They don't invest, they don't move forward, they resist technology. Those are the companies that are really going to be pushed out of place. They're not going to be able to scale. Process reengineering, those of you who are at a certain age know what business process reengineering is. This is where you go in and you just evaluate and assess and take everything that you have, pull it apart and figure out how you can make it better. When systems aren't being hit with all of this enormous scale requirements of everyday turnaround, it's a good time to take a look at that. Echoing again what Alex was saying, what we call the data scientists here, automate what you can to free up skilled resources via small AI activities, do with all of the data you're collecting. build end-to-end MT into workflows to eliminate people. You don't really need a linguist for stuff that might not have been translated anyways. So these are two very important areas, taking advantage of the data that you have and all this business process reengineering to move forward. Knowledge process outsourcing, step back and look what an LSP is about. What an LSP is really taking the work that somebody can't do efficiently inside a company because you just can't scale to the number of languages, to the number of people you need to have full-time activity. Take that business process outsourcing model and understand that what you're doing as a language service provider is going in and saying, hey, look, we have expertise, we have knowledge, we have understanding of what this knowledge stuff is. Wherever you are in the content stream, whether it's source or target kind of information, you can pull this together and you can really build a business around this KPO idea of taking your specialized expertise and building offerings around that. Further out, we've got, and this is something you're not going to do in the next couple of weeks, is become a global content strategist. Change your marketing, change your view to where you actually get involved, roll up your sleeves with companies throughout the entire con life cycle and advise them and do all sorts of other things. But got some research on that, but that's a very major initiative for any company. So in conclusion here, don't stop thinking about tomorrow is really our view of this situation. Don't prepare for the return to the past. Prepare yourself to be more competitive in the future. And as you do, optimize, work around the stuff that is really important. Keep your teams working, keep them safe, pay attention to clients. Remember the near past. What we can say now about COVID-19, and we can start saying about SARS and Ebolas and H1N1 and all of the other things that have come along. These are things that we've seen in the past, and those are things you can prepare for in the future with a business continuity plan and an approach that says, whenever I have one of these pause buttons, what I'm going to do is optimize and improve my business. So just a quick research reference in today's presentation up at csaresearch.com. This report's will be referenced on the COVID site later. And so that's it. That's my email if you have any questions. And yep.
Thank you. I really loved it. We had some great comments as well going through. So I saw somebody actually said there was their favorite presentation so far. Congratulations on that. Yep.
You.
I love the red tie.
First or second? So
I'm sure they've been here all day.
Okay.
And yeah, great insight. So I do appreciate that. If we can move just to some Q&A, I'd appreciate some perspective or some opinions that to some questions that we have. So you mentioned all this consolidation. Do you think for the industry it's going to result in a lot more acquisitions, a lot more of the mergers of like bigger to smaller people who, for example, didn't have the let's say the bankroll to survive throughout this pandemic, considering we don't necessarily know when it's going to end?
It certainly sounds like a rhetorical question. Seriously, when you look at the government funding projects, those are the ones that are meant to help the smaller companies, and unfortunately, they haven't had the the intended effect. So it's going to be a hard time for companies. So the advice that we give on that team factor piece up on the COVID site is do whatever you can to keep people on board. This is really one of the big issues, because that intellectual capital, that's the asset that, as the traditionalists say, walks in every day into your company and then walks out at the end of the day, leaves the company. And if they don't come back, you don't have a company. So if you get rid of them, the bigger companies are in a better position. The first thing that we saw in our leadership council for the larger companies was that some of the larger LSPs in the space had turned to their line of credit back in March to get the money from their lenders while the lenders weren't running for the hills or the money wasn't available. Right. And so that's one of the things that's really critical, to make sure you have the capital, and then if you can, invest in people. For example, in the US, you've got the added complication of healthcare. So that's an expensive, $20,000 if you went off and had to pay for that, your family. And if you have no income. So the important thing is figuring out how to do this. That'll help the smaller companies, but to the core of your question, This will really strain smaller companies. It'll strain mid-sized companies and bigger ones as well to show the market why they are the ones that you should be working with them. You know,
Right.
what they provide, how they can add value to your business. And that's the big challenge moving forward after the pandemic.
Great. Thank you for that. And moving towards the technology side of things, I know that you mentioned that obviously people are going to, or they have the chance to reinvent themselves. They have time to get trained. They have, you know, all these opportunities. What do you think the impact is going to be in general from, you know, tech providers after this? If, for example, the smaller companies don't have necessary capital to invest into technology, do you think it's going to drive prices down? Do you think that, you know, there's going to be less technology available? Yeah, how do you think that's going to play out?
Well, this is an opportunity for the tech vendors to get a little smarter than some of them have been. For example, when you look at pricing models, the pricing model of some of the traditional translation management systems that are on premises or hosted,
Mhm.
it's pretty onerous kind of pricing models. Whereas people have become accustomed, you know, through things like Netflix or Spotify or whatever their favorite media source is, to you know, subscription-based models, which have a low, you know, no capex. It's something is an operating expense and is spread out over a period of time. Smaller companies can deal with that. That's one issue, is the pricing model. The second is the complexity of a lot of the existing software. You know, they're big behemoths in some cases that predated, you know, they're client server systems that have been moved over to the web.
Right.
And so they still have those monolithic chunks. What we've been advocating for several years now is a move towards microservices, towards cloud-based systems,
Mhm.
to subscription-based solutions. These are the kinds of things that a smaller company is much more capable of bringing in, digesting, and working. And the important thing with all of that is going to be user interfaces as well. You can't have a crappy user interface because you have people who are, you know, they don't have time to learn your tool. What they need is
Right.
time to, you know, do their job. So if the tool gets in the way of the job, that's a non-starter. So, you know, those three things all come together.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. If you would mind just stop sharing your screen, I would appreciate that as well. That'll help the administrators take care of some things.
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We topped the 500 during your presentation. I think we're up around
All right.
520 some odd, which was fantastic. So thank you for that. I think today actually we've had about 1,800 attendees over the course of the day. So that's also fantastic for everyone that's been participating. So thank you for that, Dawn.